Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and today we are doing part 2 of the life of John Henry Holliday. Here, we will finally get to call him his true title, Doctor. And we welcome Brother Alexis to the show to be the host for these programs.
Okay, thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV and to enjoy the honor of being the host of this program. I've always wanted to know more about Doc Holliday, and having grown up in the East, we know very little other than what you might find on some TV show that's not well done. So, and this is our series on famous Americans. And Doc Holliday, we're doing, I think, a 3-part series. We did one on the origins of his family and his early childhood. Now we're going to how he became a man and do a doctor. So in our first program, we pointed out that he grew up in South Carolina and Georgia. His family moved at this time. They owned a good estate, you might call it a plantation, there in southwest Georgia, which today is known for peanuts and pecans, and still very traditional part of the country. You go to the countryside there, some towns almost entirely white.
Yeah.
And it was the poor man's land in Georgia in the 19th century. It was just recently being opened up. You either went to southwest Georgia or you went west. Well, we'll see that Doc Holliday follows that rule. So we left him as a 10-year-old boy on a plantation, and the Civil War had just broken out, and he was too young to participate in it. That's what saved his life. But all the male members of his family were called up, so he was there. So what was it like for a 10-year-old boy seeing all the pomp and circumstance of troops going to war? It must have been very impressive for him, and in a certain way, sad too, because you see all his father and brothers go off.
Yeah. The mobilization and the pomp and circumstance that went with it could not have done anything except to stir the imagination of an impressionable 10-year-old boy like John Henry Holliday, watching as he surely did the troops moving in and out of town by road and by rail, crowding the train station and creating an air of excitement on the city streets. Camp Wilder became a training center for Georgia soldiers at Griffin, and the need was great enough that Henry Holliday sold 136 acres of his 147-acre farm for the establishment of another training facility. Joseph E. Brown, Georgia's governor, wrote to Alexander H. Stevens, Georgia's former moderate congressman and the new vice president of the Confederacy, that 2 regiments had gone into training at Camp Stephens near Griffin, which I had called in honor of yourself. The war fever had come to John Henry's doorsteps. He saw his hero, Uncle Thomas Sylvester McKay, who is now 21, donned uniform of the 5th Georgian Volunteers. There were the comings and goings of other Hollidays and McKay relatives. His uncle Robert Kennedy Holliday, John Stiles Holliday, James Taylor McKay, and William Harrison McKay, cousins, and Francisco Hidalgo, his stepbrother. Besides, as one by one, they enlisted to support the cause. They all looked fine in the fresh new uniforms of the Confederate gray, surrounded by the womenfolk and children as they prepared to leave for the war. Even his cousin George Holliday, only 5 years his senior, was at the Georgia Military Institute in Marietta, preparing for the day he would be a soldier too. There were tears and goodbyes, and then one after the other, they were gone. Henry was the last to go. He bought 270 acres south of the property and made provisions for his family as best he could. Finally, on September 2nd, 1861, Henry Holliday was commissioned a major in the 27th Georgia Infantry. On October 31st, he left as well, bound for Virginia with his regiment as a quartermaster officer, arriving in time for the First Battle of Manassas. Alice Jane was left to manage family affairs like other Southern women, and the slaves were still there to produce the necessary crops to sustain John Henry and her sisters. I mean her sisters.
Okay, so
All of them.
it was quite dramatic. I'll point out that um, Doc Holliday had an adopted brother who was a Mexican because his father, when he served in the U.S. military and was in the Mexican-American War, brought back from Mexico an orphan boy and adopted him. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
So the family were Protestants, but they weren't anti-Catholic bigots, and they were very charitable people. So, okay, so I've lived in the Northeast and I know many Irish families, good friends of mine. But I know one thing, that one Irish woman is enough in a house. They're really tough cookies, and they go after the boys. You know, they're constantly an Irish woman rules the house like a man almost. And here he is at the age of 10, growing up in a house of women, Irish women, and how many were there?
You got your Hollidays, your McKays, and all of them.
Okay, so what was it like for him growing up there?
Yeah. And John Henry found himself alone in a house full of women at precisely the age at which Southern boys began their apprenticeship as men. By then he would, if he was typical, have acquired the masculine skills so critical to a male identity in Southern society. He surely knew the rudiments of hunting, fishing, wrestling, dexterity with firearms, and horsemanship. Now was the time to hone the basics into expertise. So they didn't teach him that
So who did teach him to ride, shoot, hunt, and fish? Who taught him these things?
himself.
Do you think he maybe had some help from some of the male slaves who served on the plantation?
Yeah,
I don't know if slaves could use firearms, though. Maybe that was illegal in the South, but at least the other things.
it
Um,
says it says he likely took to the woods not only to hunt and explore, but also to imagine himself in battle along with his kith and kin, holding back the Yankee hordes. Doubtless, too, he watched the fringes of Camp Stephen as recruits trained or stole away to listen to the gossip about the war around the depot and on the streets of town. So he
mhm,
probably, since they were still on his property, the
mhm,
training camp, he probably like,
mhm. Yeah, and he was probably treated with a certain amount of respect by the commanding officers of that camp, since his father had donated that land to, or sold that land for the camp. So uh, these were the days when kids had a lot of responsibility. They had a lot of self-control. So to walk a few miles into town, visit the camp, and come back would be considered nothing. But so that means basically we have to assume that he either taught himself to shoot, or maybe some of the soldiers in the camp taught him to shoot.
yeah,
And as a little side, now this is not in the topic for this morning, is was Doc Holliday considered to be an excellent shot?
yeah,
Okay, so
and
mm,
and he was and he was quick on the draw, so he always got the best of the outlaws.
mhm. And contrary to what you might think, shooting someone accurately with a pistol on a quick draw is not easy to do. Okay, pistol is the most inaccurate of all firearms, and that's why it's rarely used in modern war, except for very close range. So, uh, tell us something about his relationship with his mom. His mom has now lost her other male relatives, her husband, and she only has her son. Uh, how did he grow up with his mom? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. Let's see. For young boys like John Henry, the missing fathers were a special burden, and women often overcompensated either by spoiling their sons or by giving them too much freedom. John Henry grew close to and protective of his mother, and she strove to make him a gentleman. It's worth mentioning again that in Southern society there was a certain tolerance of childish aggression among boys to avoid feminizing them or stifling them their independence spirit. Alice Jane doubtless did the best she could, but she and her sisters pampered and spoiled the boy. Perhaps it was then, in the absence of Henry's stern demands, that young John Henry first began to show rebellious and resentment of his father.
And was he upset that his father had gone away to war and left him? Is that was the cause of it?
Yeah. And yeah.
And what did it consist in? Did he write letters to his father, or how do we know about this?
Um, it was
What
handed
caused?
it was
Yeah.
handed down information from the relatives to even to his ancestors today. So
Okay. Okay. And um, his mother comes down sick, and what kind of sickness was this?
um John Henry's mother fell ill. She was confined to bed more and more apparently the victim of chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, although that is by no means certain. Tuberculosis was known as consumption or phthisis in the middle 19th century. It was the leading cause of death at the time, accounting for 20% of all deaths in the United States. Doctors considered consumption to be non-contagious and believed that it ran in families. Curiously, too, treatment varied according to the gender of the victim of the disease. Women were encouraged to remain within the home and pursue domestic responsibilities as much as possible. They retained their responsibilities for their children and did their best to maintain a cheerful and calm demeanor. It followed a simple diet, but only regimen prescribed for women in most cases was to continue traditional female roles. But as the disease worsened, the burden fell on the female relatives and the friends to assume the responsibilities of the household.
And tuberculosis is highly contagious. Unless you wash plates and silver and your forks and knives in water with a little bleach, it will spread quickly to almost everyone in the household. So they didn't know that, and it's almost impossible to come down with tuberculosis if you're well fed. So it usually struck people who were not eating well, who were depressed, and I'm sure Mrs. Holliday was quite sad that her husband had gone off to war and she may never see him again.
Yeah.
And what news did they have from the war, and how does it happen that Doc Holliday's father returns?
Yeah. News trickled home in occasional letters from his father, his uncles, Francisco, and other relatives and neighbors. His uncle William H. McKay, serving with the 13th Georgia Volunteers of General John B. Gordon's division in Virginia, was wounded at Malvern Hill and given furlough to recuperate before returning to action. He was back with his unit in time to be elected captain on September 1862. Henry was with the 27th Georgia through the Peninsular Campaign and spent his spring and early summer at places like Williamsburg, Seven Pines, Mechanicsville, Cold Harbor, White Oak Swamp, and Malvern Hill, where the 27th left more than a third of its 1,151 men as casualties. Besides the reports of battles and lists of dead filtering back, the letters of relatives were not encouraging. William continued to be so troubled by his wounds that his recovery seemed doubtful, and he was again absent from duty until March 1863. Henry did not fare well either. Like many on both sides, he suffered so severely from chronic diarrhea or in general disability that he resigned his commission in July 1862. On August 24th, 1862, he was just discharged.
Okay, um, so uh, he returns home, and now he has a difficulty taking care of his family as the war begins to be lost. And so tell us about this. What happens when Doc Holliday's father returns home, takes care of the family with all his health problems?
Yeah. Major Holliday came home to a different situation from the one he had left. The war had already taken a heavy toll on commerce. Goods were scarce, crops were thin, and food was in short supply. His wife, Alice Jane, was virtually bedridden. He scarcely had the time to recuperate or to adjust to his wife's worsening condition before his own father, Robert, the patriarch of the Hollidays, died in Fayetteville in November. As the eldest son, Henry made arrangements for his father's funeral and oversaw the settling of his father's estate, dividing it among his brothers and sisters. As he shouldered these responsibilities, he also faced another harsh reality. With the Union victory at Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, the momentum of the war shifted dramatically. General William S. Rosecrans was commanding Union operations in Tennessee, finally began to take the offensive, and by September 9th, he had maneuvered the Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg out of Chattanooga. Bragg's incompetence was so great that General Robert E. Lee took the unprecedented step of sending 11,000 needed troops from Virginia under the command of General James Longstreet to enforce the lethargic Bragg on September 19th, September 19th through 20th, 1863. The armies met at Chickamauga in northern Georgia, just south of the Tennessee line. And it was then that Major, as Henry Holliday was now almost universally called, concluded that he needed to get his invalid wife and his son and young sisters-in-laws out of harm's way to a safer place. He recognized that because of the railroads, Atlanta would be the Union's primary target in Georgia. He began to sell property in Spalding County to prepare for the move. Between 1863 and April 1864, Henry raised $23,700 in Confederate currency from the sale of real estate in Griffin and in Spalding County. He also decided to move his family to the little town of Valdosta in southern Georgia. How he decided on Valdosta as a refugee is not clear from the record, except that contemporary papers referred it as a safe retreat.
All with the invasion of the South by the Union, the whole economy and society collapses. What we're going to see now is the complete destruction of the South. There was a lot of the Union policy was vengeance, and it was the first kind of modern war. The fact that they just decided to destroy the economy of the South, not just conquer it, and Sherman's burning everything down, destroying private properties against the Constitution, search and seizure clause. So the Union had no intention of, following the Constitution in these last stages of the war. What happens now at the Battle of Jonesburg, and why is this so important?
Yeah. Okay, far away, Major Holliday and his family had no idea that the war had come so close to the kin at Jonesboro, or that George was part of the evacuating forces, but each day brought more news. Robert Holliday's wife, Mary Ann, called Molly by her husband, was caught in the Battle of Jonesboro. In its aftermath, she saw the burial of Father Emerson Blimule and Colonel William Grace in her own backyard. Father Blimule had been killed while giving last rites to Colonel Grace, and Mary Ann saw that they were properly interred before moving her family to her uncle's Philip Fitzgerald's farm. She returned home before Union troops set up a temporary headquarters at the Fitzgerald place and destroyed everything in sight. At Jonesboro, she found her house destroyed and the property occupied. She, des- she decided then to flee south with her children.
So a Catholic priest was murdered by Union troops while he was giving the last rites on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. You don't read about that in your history books.
No.
This points out what we said before. The Masons will always talk about religious liberty, but when it comes to Catholic clergy, they'll kill them on the spot without any remorse. So how did John Henry go and save his uncle? And how did the family end up surviving this war?
Yeah. One story claimed that John Henry armed himself, took an extra horse, and went looking for Tom. With a countryside full of desperate men, it was a bold move for a youth not yet 15. But according to the story, he found his uncle on the road and led him to Cat Creek. So 14 years old, armed himself.
Let me tell you, when there's absolute chaos in the immediate aftermath of a battle, of a conquering force in your nation, to get on the horse at 14 and go anywhere is to risk your life, but people will murder you for your horse. They'll murder you for your gun, and they'll practice any kind of sort of trickery to convince you. And that's your own citizens. And then if you run into an enemy combatant, he'll just shoot you on sight, like he shot, like that priest was shot. So how did the family survive this?
Yeah, that had to be a miracle. All of them came home. So after the surrender, and everyone began their journey back to the family. James McKay had served as a field surgeon throughout the war, but he also came home safely. Francisco A. Dalgo was with the Army of Tennessee when it surrendered on April 16, 1865, at Greensboro, North Carolina. It was the same for the Hollidays. John Stiles Holliday, having served throughout the war as a surgeon in Georgia's military hospital, was never distant from his family or Fayetteville, except during the Bloody Summer in the fall of 1864. He was now with his family again. His son George, a battle-hardened veteran, despite his youth, came home as well. When Robert Kennedy Holliday showed up at Henry's place to rejoin Mary Ann and his children after being released from a Union prisoner of war camp, he clearly was a broken man, but was alive. As tough and uncertain as at times were, the Hollidays and the McKays had reason to rejoice. All came home.
That's extremely rare for any Southern family. Special blessing of God, maybe from their Catholic relatives, okay? Because it's the McKays who are Catholics, right? Or at least one of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so um, now in at this point, where there a certain disagreement breaks out between Doc Holliday, this John Henry, and his father and the townspeople on how they treated black soldiers. Is this during the war or after the war?
It's about and since it's about the occupation in Georgia, that'd be
Okay,
taken
after the war.
after the war.
Okay, so what happened and what was John Henry's disagreement?
Mm. They were first. They didn't like the Yankees taking over in the entire thing in Georgia, but then they have the black soldiers, or as they would be called, the Buffalo soldiers. Hey. Anyway, among those influenced by the force was John Henry Holliday. Tucked away on Cat Creek, John Henry did not have the daily contact with black soldiers in a new order that some townsmen did, but he shared the resentment of his father and neighbors, particularly their contempt for the black soldiers as emblems of the distress. John Henry hated the occupation the way his neighbors did, but he was restless in those days for other reasons too. Tom McKay's favorite uncle and Tom's brother, Will and James, had purchased the Banner plantation in Hamilton County, Florida, and moved away. His mother's illness was worse. His father was distant. There was little to temper the growing resentment, rebellion in his young men. So he didn't like the occupation of Georgia, but uh, people were just like how Hitler said, "All it was the Jews who caused all of our problems."
Hmm. They blamed the black people and all their problems. Common reaction after the war to look for someone who's at the fault. So, uh, and this was something that really laid heavy on the South, the way the occupation was done, because um, we have to remember the Union in starting the Civil War actually was doing something that was extra constitutional. But in punishing the people of the South and not their government and their military leaders, you notice how Lee was not punished, but
Yeah,
the people of the South were punished. And this was a complete Masonic reaction, okay? Because you want to control from the top down, therefore you don't punish the elites, you punish the locals, okay? And then you try to break up their society and break it down and make it more conform to the Masonic agenda. And this is what Reconstruction was about, though they'll never explain it in those terms. So John Henry now has to go to school. I mean, he's been out for all these years. I suppose he's been doing some homeschooling, but what does he do now in the post-war era?
change was also seen in educational opportunity. Since moving to Valdosta, John Henry had attended school. Professor Newton, a stern disciplinarian, had conducted classes from sunup to sundown in the courthouse through 1863 and 1864. Professor Mathis arrived and began holding classes at the renovated Valdosta Institute. Those years had been tough because of the scarcity of paper and textbooks, but things took a turn for the better when Samuel McWare Varney Doe settled in Valdosta in November 1865. Varney Doe would become something of a local legend. He was himself a model of discipline, learning, and industry. He eschewed switch for disciplinary purposes and instilled a pride in his students that fostered achievement. The students admired him and he rewarded them with devoted attention to their needs. He also gave them ample opportunity to show off their newly acquired learning to parents and neighbors. There were outfittings too, an co-educational environment, opportunities to improve social skills. John Henry fit in well, already well-mannered and charming as a result of his mother's instruction and experience of a large, well-educated family. He learned quickly both in the classroom and the social arena. He was popular with the girls at dances and was considered a strong-minded, even cocky, young man by his neighbors. He was not quite 15 when Dick Force was shot, and that marked a momentous year for him.
Okay, so uh, 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 what was his new job as an agent for Freedom Bureau? What is this all about, and what's the effect it had on John Holliday?
Yeah. On May 30th, 1866, scarcely 2 weeks after Forsyth, Henry accepted an appointment as an agent for Freedmen's Bureau. The appointment did not sit well with his neighbors, least of all with his rebellious son. Major even the independent spirit soon found himself denounced regularly as a worthless scallywag. Now, uh, get this right, Freedmen's Bureau. It's to help protect the rights of the freed slaves in the South. And to do that in Georgia at the time, no.
So his father who had adopted this Mexican kid during this Mexican-American War shows that he was not a racist at all, and that he accepted the emancipation of the slaves. Quite an extraordinary Christian man, and very hard to understand for the defeated Georgians. And the next big event in John Henry's youth was his ma passed away. And what testimony do we have about his ma from the local Methodist pastor?
Yeah. Then on September 16th, 1866, Alice J. McKay died. Reverend N.B. Ousley, the local Methodist minister, paid his glowing tribute to her. Why they put it in small print, I don't know. She was confined to her bed for a number of years, and was indeed a greater sufferer. She bore her afflictions with Christian fortitude. It has never fallen to my lot to know a more cheerful Christian. It was a great pleasure to visit her, to see the triumph of religion over the ills of life. She was deeply solicitous about the welfare of all she loved. She fully committed them into the hands of a merciful God, and with a full awareness that God would hear and answer her prayers, that her instructions and Christian example would still speak. She was deeply anxious about the faith of her only child. She had her faith written so her boy might know what his mother believed. She was for a time a member of the Presbyterian Church and never subscribing in heart to their article on election. She determined to change her church relation, and she was not willing to leave on record for her boy that she subscribed to said faith. She therefore joined the Methodist Church, whose doctrine she heartily accepted. I visited her a few days before her death. She was calm, cheerful, joyful. She said to me that there was not a dimming veil between her and her God. She thus passed away from the church militant to the church triumphant, leaving her friends to mourn not as those who have no hope, knowing their loved one is not dead, but sleepeth.
Okay, so that's the testimony of a Methodist minister. We as Catholics wouldn't, we aren't reading that testimony because we entirely agree with it. But I will point out that today is the 156th anniversary of her death. And it's fitting that we mention that for Doc Holliday's sense, leaving the rest in the hands of God. What were the customs of mourning then, and why does this end up causing some resentment about Doc Holliday's father remarrying?
Yeah. Let's see. What is certain is that he took her death hard. The community acknowledged her piety and gentility in glowing acknowledgment of her life, but John Henry struggled with the loss. By custom, the period of mourning was 1 year. Husbands and sons wore black for 9 months and gray for 3 months. During that time, mourners severely limited their social activities. Anything less was considered to be seriously disrespectful of the deceased. The town was stunned then when a mere 3 months after his wife was laid to rest in Sunset Hills Cemetery, Major married his neighbor's daughter, 23-year-old Rachel Martin. The marriage was performed by Reverend Osley, the same Reverend Osley who had spoken so glowingly about Alice Jane only weeks earlier. He might have overlooked the affront to tradition, but the town did not. There had been no time for courtship, which raised the question about when the relationship between Henry and Rachel began, and suggesting a greater impropriety. More important in town gossip, though, was the impact of Henry's action on the family. John Henry was angry over the disrespect his father had paid to his mother's memory, and resented his new stepmother, who was only a few years older than he. To make matters even worse, Major left his farm at Cat Creek and moved with his family into a house on Savannah Avenue owned by his new in-laws. The townspeople soon moved on to new scandals, but the relationship between John Henry and his father was cooled forever. Living in town with constant reminders of what happened, John Henry was an angry young man.
Now, what caused John Henry's first gunfight, as far as we know, and how did this fight end?
Well, it all came from this. The removal of Alice Jane's influence and the resentment against Major soon materialized in John Henry's conduct. Bertram Wyatt Brown observed that the socialization of Southern boys, including included expected experimentation of fighting, gambling, swearing, drinking, and lynching, all activities that tested a schoolboy's honor among his peers. At school one day, John Henry got into an argument with a classmate over some matter that was not recorded. The way Tom McKay recalled the incident years later, it could have had tragic results. John's opponent in quarrel challenged him to a duel with pistols. Willingly, John accepted the challenge. Two youths met with their seconds on the edge of town, and two pistols were set out before them. When he was offered his choice of pistols, John replied that he had his own pistol, that it was well loaded with balls. His opponent and the seconds were very much disconcerted over the statement by young Holliday. It was supposed to have been a mock duel, that is, pistols only loaded with powdered charges that would not inflict a wound, and here was Holliday with a loaded pistol, meaning business. They urged him to use one of the powder-loaded pistols, but to no avail. He had his own gun, and that was the one he was going to use in this affair. Seeing that he could not persuade Holliday to use one of the harmless guns, the seconds and his opponent had to explain to him that the duel was a kind of joke, but John was satisfied that the joke wasn't on him. There was no duel, and an amicable settlement was made between the two young men.
That's what you call using deterrence. Okay. But dueling is a horrible, for us Catholics, dueling is a horrible sin, and many popes even impose excommunication upon the practice. Was Doc Holliday's father faithful to his wife, the mother of Doc Holliday? Is there some testimony about that or controversy about that?
Yeah. Alice Jane's brothers and sisters were also upset by Henry's disrespect for their sister. One of the McKay girls already married, and the rest moved to the Banner plantation with their brothers. The brothers openly questioned whether Major had been faithful to their sister. Given the circumstances of his quick marriage to his closest neighbor's young daughter, not long after the December 18, 1866 wedding, the rift became public when Tom McKay filed a lawsuit against his brother-in-law to recover his sister's property, which otherwise would have gone to Major as a widowed husband. One of the pieces of property in question was the Iron Front building in downtown Griffin, Georgia. Playing the role of Solomon, the Loudoun County judge eventually divided the building into two parts, awarding half to the McKays and half to Henry Holliday as guardian for John Henry. The building was split by a partition running down the center. The judge's wisdom settled the legal issues, but healing family divisions took longer.
So they're quite wealthy family, not only own hundreds of acres, they also own one of the major buildings in the town. So after the Civil War, what happens with the governments of the southern states before they return to the Union, and how does this also have an impact in John Henry's decision of what to do in life?
Yeah. Overall resistance to Reconstruction, black codes enacted by southern states to control former slaves, and the failure of all southern states except Tennessee to ratify the 14th Amendment caused Congress now controlled by radical Republicans. There's that word again. Learned about it last night.
Mm-hmm.
To move into a second phase of Reconstruction, the South was divided into military districts. The military commanders took charge of the Reconstruction process. General John Pope, commanding the 3rd Military District, arrived in Georgia on April 1st, 1867, to assume command. One of the first actions under the new system was the reorganization of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just point out that the federal government has no authority to put military governors over sovereign states. It's just totally unconstitutional. But as we mentioned many times before, the laws written by Freemasons, you must keep. They don't have to keep. That's the way they write them. So about a year later, on the 4th of April now, in 1868, some famous person comes to speak in Valdosta, Georgia. Who was he and what happened?
Oh, yeah, a Republican. The political rancor was felt in Valdosta as deeply as anywhere in the state. J.W. Cliff, called Booby by the press, was a Republican candidate for the U.S. Congress. He arrived in Valdosta to make a campaign speech on April 4th, 1868. Cliff disregarded local ordinances and made no effort to get permission to hold a rally, but a meeting was called at the courthouse nonetheless. A substantial crowd gathered for the event, composed largely of freedmen, though including local dignitaries and curious whites. During Cliff's speech in front of the courthouse, an explosion interrupted the occasion. No one was injured, but the crowd was scattered. An investigation by local authorities revealed that a group of young men had placed a modicum of powder in a keg under the building. The evidence suggested that the incident was more of a prank than a serious threat, designed to break up the meeting with no real damage to anyone while putting a scare in the Cliff and the freedmen. The South Georgia Times argued it is idle to suppose there was any intention on the part of the boys, if they did it, to blow up their friends and relations.
A little incident shows you just the kind of tensions that were in Reconstruction South. How does John Henry get to dental school now, and who helped him make that decision?
And he finishes up his schooling in Valdosta. And this is what he learned at the school before he goes down to Atlanta, where he gets help to get to Philadelphia. Throughout all of this, John Henry's life was more concerned with mathematics, history, literature, composition, Latin, and the rest of Barndo's rigorous curriculum as he worked to complete his education. He took a job in 1869 working at the station for the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad in Valdosta. In late October 1869, John Henry and his father and stepmother may have traveled to Atlanta, where John Styles Holliday had moved after the war to attend the wedding of George Holliday to marry Elizabeth Wright. Aside from family reunion and a chance to see the recovering young city of Atlanta, the trip would have given John Henry an opportunity to talk with his uncle about his plans. Apparently, Dr. Holliday encouraged him because when John Henry returned to Valdosta, he began making plans for admission to dental school the next fall. In September 1870, John Henry Holliday, with Dr. Fink's endorsement as preceptor, arrived in Philadelphia and began his education as a dentist.
Okay, so what can you tell us about his years studying there as a dentist, and what was? Can you tell us something about what dentistry was back then?
Very crude. Nothing like we have today, even though it may seem like it. But pretty much the same tools, but now we have all the supposedly medications to numb us, but they don't work on me.
On some people, they don't work. And dentists have had a terrible reputation down through the years, but probably has to do with what they were doing in the 19th century, where they would use all force necessary to do it to your mouth that needed to be done. So it took a strong stomach to be a dentist back then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Someone with a
And
lot of daring.
yeah. So the Philadelphia College of Dental Surgery, originally chartered in 1850, which had opened its doors in 1852. The Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery was chartered in 1856, and it still exists today.
Wonderful. And during what years did he study there?
Let's see here. He began his studies on October 3rd, 1870, and his students faced a rigorous curriculum in chemistry, mechanical dentistry, metallurgy, dental pathology, therapeutics, dental histology, operative dentistry, uh, physiology, anatomy, microscopic anatomy, and surgery, as well as clinical instruction in operative and mechanical dentistry.
Wow, I'm amazed by that curriculum. That was quite scientific and quite complete. A little of everything to get him on his way. And so, when does he actually get awarded the title of Doctor of Dentistry?
Yeah. So he has to attend daily lectures and demonstrations morning, afternoon, and it was a rigorous schedule, 6 days a week.
And how many? And was he there for a year or several years?
He was there for he got it all done in about 2 years.
And I guess this was paid by his mother's estate. That was part of that building that was involved in that lawsuit. So,
Yeah.
because to live in Philadelphia for 2 full years in a boarding house was no small expense. And he's 20. If I get it right now, he's 20 years old, or he's 19 years old.
Yeah.
So a lot of self-independence there too, since he didn't have any relatives in town. I know a little about studying in Philadelphia, not directly, but because both my parents studied in Philadelphia University when they were young people, and you had to stay in a boarding house. The boarding house for women only allowed women of the best reputation in, and you had to come back by like 8 in the evening, and you couldn't stay out at night. And that was in the 1940s. So you can imagine it back then. And the streets of Philadelphia would have been filled with all kinds of traffic, because if you're not from the East, you may not know, but Philadelphia is a hubbub port. It's one of the major ports in the east, and it has big docks and all kinds of commerces coming in and out. Not just merchandise, but also coal, because Pennsylvania is one of the biggest industrial states in the east with coal and iron production, and lots of railways coming hither and thither and all over the place. And so the air of the city would be filled with the steam of steam engines and the smoke of coal ovens and the hawkers on the streets. And this is the 1870s, so the Italians have just started coming and immigrating from Italy. So you might have, hear different languages on the street, the different Europeans pouring into the city. It was quite an active city. How does, yeah, go ahead.
He scheduled to graduate on March 1st, 1872. There was one problem, however. Qualification for graduation required that the candidate must be 21 years of age. He was still more than 5 months shy of turning 21, a requirement for licensed dentists in several states, including Georgia. His name appeared on the graduation announcement, but he would not receive his credentials until August. John Henry would have to work as an assistant on someone else in the interim or find some other use for his time.
Okay, so how does he resolve this difficulty?
So he goes home, works with Dr. Frank, and enjoyed the company of his relatives. But by then, he knew his future was not in Valdosta. He had time on his hands before he could open his own practice, so he decided to gain experience and see a little of the country. One of his classmates, A. James Futures Jr., who wrote his thesis on the same topic that John Henry did, was returning to his home state of Missouri to practice in St. Louis. Futures opened an office on 4th Street. Young Holliday joined him then.
Okay, so having a taste of northern life, you're going to get of quiet Georgia and go to. And St. Louis, we must know at this time was the hubbub in the West. They had just built a steel bridge across the Mississippi, and tremendous amounts of rail traffic was now going through St. Louis to the whole West. It was the a place to go if you wanted to head out onto the prairies or anywhere. And trains and transport connections to Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, California. It was all directed through St. Louis. St. Louis was like the metropolis of the Midwest, although it's kind of more closer to Chicago than it is. It's a lot closer to Chicago than it is to New Orleans. A deeply Catholic city. And is this where Doc Holliday, Doc John Henry Holliday meets the woman Kate, and tell us something about that.
Yeah. Near Future's office was a theater and a saloon. One of the employees there was a young woman named Kate Fisher, but that was not her real name. She was born Mary Catherine Harmony in Pest, Hungary on November 7, 1850. The first of 7 children, her parents immigrated to the United States in about 1860 and settled in Davenport, Iowa, with what amounts to a colony of Hungarians. Kate's father purchased property there in 1863, but by 1866 both he and his wife had died, leaving the care of the minor Harney children under the guardianship of the children's brother-in-law, Gustav Susimir. Guardianship soon passed to the family attorney, Otto Smith, however, who reported in October 1867 that Mary Catherine could not be advised of the mortgage of the family property, but she went, as it is said, to parts unknown. And she later claimed that she met John Henry in the spring of 1870, but Kate had trouble remembering dates late in life. Other internal evidence in her writing suggests that she meant 1872. Apparently they had an affair or perhaps a professional relationship. In later years, concern about the negative image of her published sources Determined to salvage her reputation, she even claimed they were married, but though her account was slanted, even deceptive, it contains details that suggest that she did not meet and have a relationship with John Henry that spring and summer. She would remember that John Henry Holliday's stay in St. Louis was a brief adventure, and she would recall that he returned to Georgia to claim an inheritance. In fact, during July, he did return to Georgia to claim his inheritance from his mother and to begin his practice. Kate would not forget Dr. Holliday, and as it turned out, John Henry would not forget her.
Okay. So after his brief stay in St. Louis, he goes back to Georgia, and what what are the things he does there, and how's this lead to him taking his famous decisions to go west? He gets into practice. He claims his mother's inheritance.
Yeah, that's it. John Henry moved in with John Stiles Holliday that summer. Dr. Holliday had moved to Atlanta after the war and gone into the grocery business with R.W. Tidwell, another Fayetteville transplant. It had been quite successful to the point that Dr. Holliday gave up the regular practice of medicine. Holliday's son, Robert Alexander, called Hub by family members, was working with him as well. John Stiles Holliday was highly regarded in New Atlanta, and John Henry moved into not only a large and comfortable household, but social and professional credibility as well. Following his return to Georgia, yeah, John Henry was introduced to Dr. Arthur C. Ford. Ford was one of the most prominent dentists in the state. He also had a colorful history. He was an Englishman who came to Georgia by the way of South Africa. He fought in the Confederate Army, was wounded at Sharpsburg, established himself as a dentist in Atlanta after the war as the partner of Dr. Albert App. Ford gained an inviolable reputation. He was a charter member of the Southern Dental Association, formed in 1869, and was active in the Georgia State Dental Society. You may have met John Henry through Dr. Samuel Hape, the brother of Ford's partner and owner of the Southern Dental Depot. He was living in the home of John Stiles Holliday. Albert Hape had terminated his partnership with Ford, was moving his practice to Thompson, Georgia. On July 26, 1872, the following notice appeared in the Atlanta Constitution. I hereby inform my patients that I leave to attend the sessions of the Southern Dental Association in Richmond, Virginia this evening, and will be absent until the middle of August, during which time Dr. John H. Holliday will fill my place in my office. Arthur C. Ford, Dentist, Office 26, Whitehall Street.
That was the 19th century. They put public notices in the newspaper, and people read the newspapers because they had information in it. Now you can't find news of anything anywhere. And okay, so we have a historic record that he was in Atlanta and serving as a dentist in the summer of 1872. What is the rest of what is his? So does he get back into medicine and he's going to practice on his own in Atlanta after this?
Yeah.
And
It was a grand opportunity. Ford's prominence ensured the right connections and the best chances for success in the new city. Young Dr. Holliday turned 21 the same day that Dr. Ford returned to Atlanta, and less than a month later, Major signed over the property he had held in guardianship for John Henry to his son. John Henry's future seemed bright. In November, he visited Griffin and registered his deed for the Iron Front building. He had come of age, and for the occasion, his uncle gave him a model 1851 Navy Colt revolver, like those he had given to his own three sons. John Henry had reason to be proud. Never the aristocrat, he was now fairly a Southern gentleman, well-bred, educated, and prepared for the successful professional life he trained for as part of the New South.
Okay, so he had quite quite an active youth and childhood to remember. And in our next program about Doc Holliday, what are we going to discuss?
Him moving west and moving through Texas, where he gets up into where he goes to Colorado, Wyoming, and I think where he might meet up with a lawman.
Okay, and to remind everyone who doesn't know much about Doc Holliday is famous for how he died, right?
Well, no, it was famous for helping numerous times Wyatt Earp and his brothers in
Mhm.
Dodge City. Then they go to the southwest, Tombstone, Arizona, and they didn't really want to get back into the law, but uh, there was a criminal gang down there who called themselves the Cowboys, but weren't cowboys. They were like the mafia of the Southwest, and so they were forced back into being lawmen. And they were challenged to a fight at the OK Corral, and that's where you hear about Doc all day.
Okay, I got you back, I think now.
Yeah,
Okay, so you were saying he was famous for helping uh,
Wyatt Earp and his brother.
Wyatt Earp. Okay, and he was at the he was at the shootout at the OK Corral. That's the famous thing, and and so our next program we're going to cover all that history and to the end of his life. Okay,
Mm,
so this program is so informative. I encourage parents to use it who are homeschooling, or even if not homeschooling, get your kids to listen to it, because this is the kind of detailed history you're not going to find elsewhere in Catholic media. And I wish we could do it with more images and make it more like a documentary, but we're working on thread kind of resources here at Ordo Militaris Radio TV, and we'd be able to do it a lot better if we could get some of you to make a free will subscription or a monthly pledge, so that we could increase our equipment's ability to produce higher quality videos and documentaries. And so if you like any of the programs, go to ordo-militaris.net and go to the bottom of any program page and press the button, and any donation you make goes to equipment. It doesn't go to AJ's salary or my salary. We do this absolutely free of charge as an apostolate for educating members of our order and Catholics, the general public who listen. And I see we're having listeners coming from all over. We even have some Russian Orthodox listening to this station. So it's a wonderful way of helping everyone get to know the truth of history and important topics about Christianity.
yeah. In all of our Doc Holiday programs, this book is linked directly to the Amazon page where you can get it. It's a great read. It's action packed. It's fun read. Don't let the size scare you. It's 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 what we use with the programs. A lot of information, a lot of action, a lot of is
Mhm.
super interesting.
Fascinating read. And a good book is much better than TV programs, but hopefully this will encourage you to get the book and read it and keep it on your bookshelf. And if you do homeschooling, require your children to read the book and do a
Mm-hmm.
report on it,
Yeah.
because it opens up a whole world that we never lived in and have no experience of. And it helps you understand a lot about where America's come from and where it's gone to. So thank you, AJ, for having me on as host on this second program about Doc John Henry Holliday. And I look forward to the third and climatic episode of this series.
Yeah. You're welcome. This is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Vult.